This weekend, Britain braces for a wave of protests outside hotels housing asylum seekers, and the flashpoint is Epping, where a High Court ruling blocked the continued use of the Bell Hotel for migrant accommodation. Far from settling the issue, the judgment has ignited dozens of demonstrations from Aberdeen to Exeter as local councils and national politicians seize on the precedent. Two groups now dominate the streets: the self-styled Pink Ladies, staging high-profile protests in London, and Stand Up to Racism, promising counter-mobilisation in Bournemouth, Cardiff, Leeds and elsewhere. Between them, they reflect the bitter polarisation of Britain's asylum debate. On the one side, activists claiming to defend local communities from unwanted imposition. On the other, campaigners determined to shield some of the most vulnerable people in the world from hostility and intimidation. The figures are stark. More than 32,000 asylum seekers remain in hotels, an 8% increase during Labour's first year in power, and the government insists it's cutting the asylum backlog, reducing costs and raising removals of failed claimants. Yet the hotel system has proved both politically toxic and practically unsustainable. Councils of every political colour, Labour, Conservative and even Reform UK, are exploring whether they can follow Epping's example and launch legal challenges. Some argue hotels breach planning rules, others cite community disruption and escalating police costs. And here lies the trap. To close asylum hotels without providing alternatives is not a solution, but an abdication of responsibility. The Home Office has a statutory duty to prevent destitution. If hotels are ruled out, refugees will need somewhere else to go. Already local authorities are being asked to identify rentable accommodation, housing stock that scarcely exists in towns, already gripped by shortages and rising rents. In other words, closing hotels could push Britain from one crisis straight into another, out of the frying pan directly into the fire. Of course, there are disused office buildings. The far right senses opportunity. Groups like Homeland and Britain First are exploiting local anger, inserting themselves into otherwise ordinary community protests. Councils now admit demonstrations are being hijacked by extremists with long histories of anti-migrant agitation. Meanwhile, survivors, charities warn that legitimate concerns about violence against women are being cynically twisted into a weaponized anti-migrant agenda. As a coalition of women's groups recently stated, this diverts attention from the real problem of gender violence across society and scapegoats vulnerable outsiders. For Labour, the Epping ruling is a dangerous moment. Keir Starmer has promised to end hotel use by 2029, but that deadline now looks impossibly distant. The Refugee Council warns that the whole system could unravel before them as councils queue up for injunctions. Yvette Cooper insists Labour is acting in a managed and ordered way, but opponents from Nigel Farage to Robert Jenrick claim the patience of the country has snapped. Of course, it's ironic that Robert Jenrick was part of the Home Office in the first place. So, where does this leave us? The asylum hotel saga exposes the threefold failure of Britain's migration system. First, a failure of planning. Hotels were only ever meant as short-term contingency accommodation, but had become semi-permanent by default. Secondly, a failure of politics. Both major parties have indulged in slogans about stopping the boats without creating viable capacity for those who arrive. And third, a failure of courage. Too many leaders are willing to pass the problem down the line, waiting for the courts or the police to contain the fallout. The result is a combustible mix. Asylum seekers feel hunted and terrified, councils feel overburdened and ignored, and communities feel decisions are imposed from above without consent. All the while, Britain spends billions on an arrangement everybody knows is unsustainable. Ending the use of hotels is a worthy goal, but it must be accompanied by a credible alternative: faster decisions, fair dispersal of people across the country, and an investment in housing stock that benefits both refugees and citizens. Otherwise, each new closure will only feed fresh protest, and Britain will lurch deeper into a cycle of anger, litigation, and fear. The Epping ruling may be a landmark, but without leadership it risks becoming a symbol of paralysis. The question is not whether asylum hotels will go, but the question is whether Britain can find a humane and workable system where the protests, before the protests consume us all. At the moment, it doesn't look as if that's likely because people are looking in the wrong direction, as they did during the Conservative period. Rather than questioning whether or not there's a better understanding of the 1951 Refugee Convention available, and whether that could eventually be implemented on a worldwide basis. We're looking at knee-jerk and some sort of absurd interpretation of wording, playing around with the words rather than dealing with people. And that's symptomatic of Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Yvette Cooper, and so on. It's not exclusively a Labour problem, it's not exclusively a Conservative problem. It is, it seems, a problem with British politics in the last 20 years, playing around with words rather than doing the job.